the basic understanding of the role of the church in society, in the world, that it's not a jack of all trades, but rather it's one that brings the good news of salvation in Jesus Christ. It's one that disciples believers, and then the believers go as salt and light in the world. As basic as that might sound to you, that sounds extremely foreign to the average African ear.
Welcome to the Crossway Podcast, a show where we sit down with authors each week for thoughtful interviews about the Bible, theology, church history, and the Christian life. I'm Matt Tully, and today I'm talking with Conrad Mbewe. Conrad has served as pastor of Kabwata Baptist Church in Lusaka, Zambia for over 30 years, and is a senior lecturer at African Christian University. He's also the author of numerous books, including God's Design for the Church, a guide for African pastors and ministry leaders from Crossway. Today, Conrad and I discuss what American Christians should know about the church in Africa. He dispels common misconceptions related to African Christianity, summarizes the big issues facing local congregations, including unbiblical superstitions, widespread poverty, and a lack of theological education. And he highlights what American believers can learn from our African brothers and sisters in Christ. One other note before we start the interview. Crossway is partnering with pastors, churches, and ministries to translate and distribute thousands of copies of Conrad's book throughout the continent of Africa. If you have a heart for Africa and want to find out how you can get involved, please visit crossway.org/Africa. That's crossway.org/Africa. Let's get started. Conrad, thank you so much for joining me today for the Crossway Podcast.
Thank you, Matt. Looking forward to it.
So you currently serve as a pastor in Lusaka, Zambia, and my guess is that many of our listeners, maybe most of our listeners, don't know a lot about Zambia. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about your country and also even your city that you live and minister in.
All right. Zambia is a landlocked country, so we don't have any access to the sea or ocean. It's somewhere between the equator and the Tropic of Capricorn, right in the middle there, surrounded by about 8 countries. It's got a population of about 15 million people, with many small tribes and languages. We've got about 70 dialects that make up our entire nation. English is our major language of communication. We were once colonized by the British, and so it was decided after independence to just keep the English language. As rightly said, I live in Lusaka. I minister in Lusaka. It's the capital city. It's got a tenth of the population for the whole country, so roughly 1.5 million people, with people from all over the country. Our population, in terms of age, we are given to understand by those that study demographics that the population is largely young people below the age of 25, and so that's really the kind of age group that we are largely ministering to. So that's what I would say about Zambia. It's democratic. We've been changing governments every 5 years or so for the last 50 plus years.
And tell us a little bit about your church. I know you've been a pastor of the same church for a few decades now. So just paint a picture of what your church is like.
Yeah, Kabwata Baptist Church, again, represents the environment in which we are, largely young people. We have a membership of about 450. The church was planted in 1981, became autonomous 5 years later in 1986. Then a year later, 1987, I was called to be pastor. So I've been around for about 33 years. At that time, it was roughly 30 to 40 members, and we didn't own any property. So a lot has been happening since then. And right now, we're very involved in church planting work, not only in Zambia, but across Africa. We've planted slightly over 30 churches.
Wow.
And so it's been a great joy seeing that multiplication factor happening.
Yeah, and what's that been like? Have you been raising up men to be church planters from within your congregation, or are you partnering with other churches across the continent to plant those churches?
It's been a bit of both. We've had individuals that have grown through the ranks in our own church. But what has also happened is that we run an internship program where individuals with a sense of call to the ministry in their various churches come and spend a whole year with us. And what tends to happen is some of them would have already been at a Bible college where the doctrinal position underwent a complete transformation. They cannot go back to the churches they came from, and they don't quite know what to do, so they come and spend a year with us. And usually, among those individuals, we tend to connect with one or two, and then we send them out to go and plant churches. Usually, those that come from their own countries are the ones we send back to their own African countries, and then we help them with support for them to plant churches there.
So you mentioned this Bible college. Is that the same thing as the African Christian University that you helped to, I believe, found?
Yes and no. The internship program is at our own local church. So we have capacity to handle 6 individuals as a maximum at any one time. But we've also been running for many years now a part-time college that we've been calling under different names. Right now it's called the Lusaka Ministerial College. And then more recently, we have begun an actual university, the African Christian University, where an individual like Vodi Bokam has also come over and is heading the School of Divinity. But we do have other schools as well for agriculture, for business, and for education.
Wow.
So it's a wider university than just theological studies.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like then, whether it's in that university context or a Bible college context or even an internship context at your church, there's it seems like education, training up of not just pastors and church leaders, but even lay Christians is an important part of your ministry and your strategy as a church leader. So maybe unpack that for us a little bit, especially speaking to perhaps a primarily American audience where we're used to there being colleges and universities. It's sort of maybe an assumed reality there. Why is that such an important priority for you?
Yes, well, we're definitely a good 100, 200 years behind what has happened in the West, because until quite recently, churches were only involved in primary and at the most secondary education. And yes, we were as churches doing a lot, and therefore government tended to appreciate partnership with the church because our schools were definitely the better schools in terms of infrastructure, in terms of just the holistic education that was being provided for individuals. However, there was a disconnect with the aspect of career development and a disconnect with respect to the training of those that would be pastors and leaders of churches. And that has kept our churches very, very weak in terms of wrestling with the current issues in our society. And so there's been a movement towards having tertiary education, not simply at a basic diploma level, but going into degree level education. There's been a push in that direction in the very recent past. You won't believe this, but for instance, the whole of Zambia, you could not go into a seminary and get a master's level upwards education until perhaps the last 5 years. The whole country. So it's a very new aspect. We're behind, and we need to do our best in order to strengthen the Christian church and enable indigenous Christian leaders to be able to help the church answer the demand of the Great Commission for us to truly be salt and light in our world.
Yeah, it's so interesting hearing you talk about the growth in higher level education and ministry training. I think sometimes in our context, you can hear sort of the idea of, well, seminaries and colleges, they can often lead to this maybe over-intellectualized type of spirituality, or an overemphasis on theology to the detriment of practically living in obedience and loving others. I wonder, what would you say to that as maybe a suspicion that can sometimes be in a Western context of that higher education?
Yes, I do want to agree with those that have expressed fear, and perhaps not just fear, but they have seen it happening and they are running away from it. Because I've gone as far as one goes with education. I have a PhD, and therefore I've been exposed to what's happening in the context of higher education and even theological training. I mean, I had a young man visiting me recently, and he was concerned about the fact that very few theological colleges that he's met here in Zambia are deliberately dealing with what he called contextual theology. And when I challenged him about it, it was fairly clear that he was busy with some philosophy, some learning that he's picked up in a theological college context that's completely divorced from what's happening in the churches. I remember I challenged him. I said, look, I've been a pastor for so many years. Could you tell me what it is that you are concerned about that's not happening in the churches? And he was at sea in terms of trying to bring something out. And yet he came to visit me with a lot of energy and gusto about the need to address this matter. And in the end, I told him quite frankly that the problem is that a lot of this sort of university education is divorced from the local church. It's divorced from the reality that pastors are dealing with. And as a result, you are making mountains out of little anthills. When if we could have this connection made between the church and tertiary education, tertiary theological education, we're going to avoid the kind of disaster that, for instance, this young man himself is in. So in that sense, I agree with those that are expressing this concern. And the reason, as I've already hinted, is the disconnect between the church and tertiary theological training.
Yeah. So I think, as we've already, probably most listeners to the Crossway podcast are based in the U.S. and I think sometimes for us, who, if we haven't traveled much or just don't have a lot of exposure to Christians living in other parts of the world, it can be easy to assume that maybe fall into one of two camps. On the one hand, maybe assume that Christians, say, living in Zambia are so different from us that there's really so little commonality there that, we would just feel like it'd be such a different kind of experience. Maybe on the other hand, some people might be prone to think, to kind of downplay the significance of some differences, legitimate differences that might exist. So I wonder if you could help us to navigate that a little bit. And maybe let's start with similarities. You've spent a lot of time in the U.S. and interacting with American believers and churches and church leaders. What are some of the things that would make us more similar than we might realize?
All right. Well, first of all, I mean, we have the same God, we have the same fallen nature, we have the same salvation in Jesus Christ, and for those of us who are Christians, we are indwelt by the same Spirit. That's a lot of commonality. In other words, I can therefore cross the ocean, preach in a church in New York, Washington, in Florida, wherever it might be. And as long as I go to the Bible, faithfully expound it, I'm basically speaking to an American audience exactly the same way that I'll speak to a Zambian audience. So in that sense, we wrestle with the same indwelling sin, the same Satan, the devil, enticing us away from the living God. Interpersonal clashes at that level will be quite the same. So that's what is in common. And therefore, missionaries can cross the ocean, arrive today, and tomorrow be preaching in our context, and there will be a lot that will connect with us. Where we need to do a lot more listening, where I need to do a lot more listening when I'm crossing over to America, or even before I get there, where Americans need to do a lot more listening, is first of all, in terms of application of biblical truth, because of the fact that in that sense, at that level, the noises that we are hearing are vastly different. For instance, you've just gone through elections, and the major issue that was screaming at all of you in the US had to do with elections, had to do with the former president and the incoming president. It had to do with Republicans and Democrats and so on. That was the noise that's been there, and the implications of all that with respect to racial issues, to do with sexuality issues, to do with abortion and so on, pro-life being on the other hand. So that's the kind of noise that tends to be around the American context. Whereas here, yes, there's a little bit of that, but that's not the major noise that we are hearing. So, for instance, in my context, I'm dealing with a lot of young people who are coming into the Christian faith for the first time. And to them, the promised land is America. That's the promised land. Everything there is wonderful and big. And if we can only get out there, we will have our lives lived in abundance with a capital A. And to try and just get them round to appreciate that life in abundance is when you are walking with God. It doesn't matter where you are, when you're walking with God. And then there are issues of poverty at a very basic level. Just this afternoon, I had a lady coming to see me. Her husband died. The husband was a member of our church and died in 1997. And she was basically saying, I have nowhere to go in terms of educating my children. Zero. Now, in the US, there will be that check that comes from the state. In Zambia, there's nothing like that. So we have to deal with issues of poverty. We have to deal with issues of the absence of institutions like schools, medical facilities, and so on and so forth in a lot of places. So it's things like that that we then say, okay, we need to address them. The positives, for instance, of the extended family system, and then the negatives of the extended family system. Those, again, are realities that our people have to wrestle with. So it's more at the level of application, in that level of detail, just under the skin, that often those that cross the Atlantic to come and minister here need to do a lot of listening, so that they get to appreciate the undercurrents. And once they really come to grips with the undercurrents, they'll be in a better position to minister.
Yeah, and I want to return to some of those undercurrents, some of those African-specific issues that do affect application. But maybe just going back briefly, you mentioned the large numbers of young people becoming Christians for the first time, maybe the first person in their family to come to faith. And what is the religious background that many of these young people are coming from?
Yeah, well, most Zambians would actually claim to be Christian. At least 80%, maybe even 85%. But it's largely Roman Catholicism. Half of the those who profess Christianity in Zambia would be from a Roman Catholic background. And then a lot of them beyond that would be individuals who are coming from a church that's completely liberal. So it would have had its roots in the Protestant Reformation. But now it's basically simply a church which teaches morals, good morals. And so they would have come to repentance and faith outside that context. And then that's when they would have appreciated what the Bible actually has to say in terms of doctrine and practice, centered around the person and work of Christ. Now, because they're coming from a background where they were religious, nominal Christians, they just assumed that it was Christianity. And yet, right under the facade was everything that's worldly, including traditional religious beliefs, all mixed up in a form of syncretism. So when they become Christians, there is a lot of baggage they need to offload. And it takes a bit of time, because they're sort of hitting against the wall constantly as you're preaching. And they're realizing, things need to get off their backs. And then in due season, the biblical worldview begins to form. And that way, they can now go forward on their own, because they can now see what isn't fitting into the world that the Bible says they ought to have.
Yeah.
So that's the situation.
So what are some of those syncretistic religious beliefs or practices or traditions that you're often finding you have to kind of disentangle from biblical Christianity?
Well, I could throw in a few right away. One of them is simply what I call the chief mentality, which has to do with a failure to recognize that leadership is meant to be servanthood. It's meant to serve others. because chiefs have an aura around them that makes them completely untouchable, that makes them individuals who, whatever they say, is carried out. Individuals who, in the process, can get away with a lot which is wrong. Now, that is something that is so much part of the air that pastors easily take on that kind of atmosphere as well. So these individuals are coming from that kind of background, and then they come into a church where, for instance, I carry my backpack. That's a crisis already within them, because how on earth can such a person who's supposed to be so high carry not just his backpack but his Bible, for that matter? Other people should be carrying it.
So have you had to be intentional about stamping that down, even in relation to you? Have you found that people, if you don't intentionally discourage it, people would sort of start to treat you differently because of this mentality?
Yes. I mean, okay, in my church, I've been there for over 30 years, so the atmosphere there is completely different. But it's often a visitor who comes and sees me stand up at the end of the service and throw my backpack onto my back and start walking out. They just can't process that. Because where they're coming from is not just out of question. That's like throwing mud at a king. Just don't do that. But it's when I also preach at conferences and other churches, that's where it really happens a lot, because I arrive there, I'm coming out of my car, and already people want to take my Bible out of my hands. It's all right. And when I've sat down and I'm ready now to go and preach, again, other people are coming to want to get my Bible to take it up to the podium, because the pastor is not supposed to do that. So it's fairly common around Zambia and around the continent.
So obviously Africa is a huge continent filled with millions of Christians, and as you said, I think it was over 70 different dialects even within your own country. So there's so much variety and diversity. But are there any other common challenges facing the church in Africa today? You mentioned poverty, widespread poverty, maybe a lack of theological education. Any other things stick out to you as issues that you would want Western believers who aren't as familiar with the African context to be aware of, things that we could be praying for?
Yes, well, one of the most obvious issues is the basic understanding of the role of the church in society, in the world, that it's not a jack of all trades, but rather it's one that brings the good news of salvation in Jesus Christ. It's one that disciples believers, and then the believers go as salt and light in the world. As basic as that might sound to you, that sounds extremely foreign to the average African ear, because the church, it's helped with education and medical situations, but those are meant to be secondary tools to the work of the gospel. But they've taken on a life of their own. But more than that, the church ends up being used for monitoring elections, for instance. The church ends up being the vehicle through which finances are churned in, especially for the so-called man of God who becomes stinking rich. The church ends up being more of the equivalent of a witch doctor's den. People go to a witch doctor to to have bad luck removed from their lives. If they were not able to have children, the witch doctor sort of plays with a few bones on the ground and enables them, well, they believe enables them in the process to have children, to have a job, for their business to go forward and so on. Well, that's now the in thing with the man of God in the church through deliverance sessions. They become the main thing. And again, it's for people to come to realize that that's foreign to the actual Bible they are holding in their hands. That what took place from Acts 2 itself was that the believers gave themselves to the apostles' teaching. In other words, the church was primarily an educational institution. People went to hear what God had to say to them about salvation, sanctification, and the fruit of that. So, if one was to say, what is it? Yes, there's such a variety on African soil, but what stands out as something that American Christians need to hear and know, I think that's what I would say, and that's what I'm most jealous about. Yes, there's poverty. Yes, there are a lot of these other things, but if we can just get the church to be doing what God wants it to do, the fruit of that is going to correct so much else in the rest of the continent of Africa.
Yeah. What would you say is maybe one of the most common misunderstandings that you've encountered among American Christians when it comes to Christianity in Africa and how the church is doing?
Yeah, perhaps two things. One is the fact that the non-Christians in Africa, that Africans generally are very open to the gospel, that they are sort of falling over each other to embrace the gospel message. That's very far from the truth. Yes, the Christian faith is galloping forward, but it's galloping forward through a lot of hard work. Africans generally don't want to cause offense, and so they have the attitude, if someone is saying, Jesus Christ is offering this, will you receive him? They're not likely to say no, even if in their hearts they mean no. They will say yes just so that they don't cause offense. And therefore, if you offer them a sinner's prayer, they will repeat it after you. But as soon as you're gone, it's all gone. And that's the thing that people in the West often mistake when they cross over and they do evangelistic work. That's number one. The second is that Africa can easily, nicely, or maybe neatly be divided into three categories. There is the Islamic North, and then south of the Sahara, there is the urban areas, and then you have the rural areas. Now, what tends to happen in most people in the West is that they are fixated on one of those categories. So some of them, all they are saying in Africa are Muslims destroying Christian churches and burning them down and killing Christians, and therefore there's need to stop Islam from what it's doing. What they don't realize is that that's almost exclusively right at the top, somewhere the Sahara Desert going upwards. South, yes, Muslims are there. They are such a small minority that they are behaving themselves. Okay, so they're fixated on that. Others are fixated on rural Africa, the need for clean water, for just basic infrastructure, and so on. So it's all about providing finances to help forestall starvation and so forth, refugees and things like that. which it's there, but it's again just one section of Africa, and it's important to diversify as well. And then you have the third, which is the kind of area, for instance, I minister in, where you have sort of middle class, upper class, young professionals going upwards, individuals who can cross over to England, Australia, or America in order to get a job and basically just fit in. That's again another part of Africa. And sometimes in Africa, you can have all these three being neighbors to each other. Within the same wider city. So just realizing that there is that kind of threefold diversity would indeed help our Western friends to appreciate a little more of Africa and its needs, because it means that the needs in each of these three will be quite different.
It's so interesting how, just depending on what we've seen, what we've been exposed to personally, and especially if we haven't done a lot of our own research or talking or had direct experience, our view of things can be so one-sided or limited. It makes me even think of a broader category. I think that can be at play when it comes to even how we view the Christian faith and what it means to be a Christian, to follow God. And it's, we all obviously as fallen humans have blind spots when it comes to our faith and what it means to be a church and to love our neighbors. And that's where it can be very helpful to have Christians from different contexts with different perspectives kind of speak in and help us to see our blind spots. So I wonder if you could serve us in that way, American Christians in that way this morning. What are some of the blind spots that you have noticed when it comes to gospel-loving, Bible-believing Christians in America, maybe in the West generally?
I get asked that question quite a lot when I visit the US, the UK, I think primarily those two areas. And I am often reluctant, primarily because there are pastors there as well who are serving faithfully and have got a global view as well. Which I've also had the opportunity to have. If I was to speak, one thing would be that a lot of people, for instance, in the US, their world begins and ends with the United States of America. Outside that is simply, people in need. All the news they ever listen to is in America, and that's quite shocking, but it's true. And then what I would therefore say is that brothers and sisters in the US need to, apart from listening to and watching media house channels that are particularly American, that they should deliberately subscribe to those that are outside, those that are global. Listen to podcasts, for instance, that are also outside their immediate context. Because what that does is it enriches their lives. Because the earth is the Lord's, the whole of it. And therefore, even their prayers would be more balanced and more relevant, if I could put it that way, to the wider cause of God across the continent, the planet. Closely related to that is the somehow the view that the American politicians, the sort of determine the future of America, when really it's the church through the gospel that will determine the future of that great country. And I think that blind spot is very difficult to deal with, because I think anybody who tries to speak into it immediately loses the audience immediately. Yeah, and gets some level of backlash.
Has that been the case for you? Have you experienced that?
Not quite, because as I said, I've been quite reluctant. I mean, every so often people said to me, "So Conrad, what's your comment about this?" And my answer, as usual, is, "Sorry, you've got enough pastors there to handle. I'm not getting into the fight. I'm not pulling any dog's ears here, because I'll just get beaten. I don't think I will correct anything one way or the other. There's too much noise taking place among brethren for things that are really happening out there, which the gospel itself would induce us and correct, if only we can put the gospel and the church in the place where it ought to be, as salt and light in the world." So that's the little that I would say about that. But otherwise, as I said at the very beginning, I have a lot of friends who are good, godly, well-proven pastors in the US who are doing a commendable job with a global view, and I'm almost certain that what I've said, they themselves would say.
Yeah. So when it comes to cultivating that global view of Christianity around the world, you mentioned listening to podcasts and subscribing to news sources that are based in other parts of the world. What do you think about short-term trips, whether that's a mission trip per se, or maybe just a trip to visit another church or other Christians in a different part of the world? I know there are lots of different opinions about the value of short-term trips and what role they should or shouldn't play. But just briefly, do you think there's value there? Is that something you would encourage Western Christians to do if they're able to do something like that?
Yes, I definitely am in the category that would say yes to that. I know why a number of church leaders are wary of this, because it becomes a kind of religious holiday that people are going into to simply sort of get exposed and enjoy something of the world out there. But at the same time, let's not throw the baby out together with the dirty bathwater. A lot of individuals have had their missions focus sharpened to the point of laser target, because they've gone out there and they've visited and they've seen what the television screen could not show them. They've seen that here is the place worth living and dying for Christ. And they've gone back home determined that they must now come over as long-term missionaries. So yes, there's a lot that ends up simply being, as I said, some kind of holiday, but there's a lot also to be grateful for through short-term missions. So it's a matter of managing it well and bringing in the fruit.
Yeah. All right, well, maybe as a last question, I wonder, as you think about your own church community right now, both the lay people there, fellow pastors and elders who are there ministering alongside of you, what would you say is one or two specific things that our listeners could be praying for your church and maybe even the church more broadly in Africa this week? Give us one or two concrete things that we can be praying for.
All right. Well, one of them they'll easily identify with is COVID-19. It's wreaking havoc on the continent. The first wave did not do as much damage in terms of the loss of lives. This second wave is reaping quite a number of lives So, I mean, we are prone to sort of HIV, AIDS, Ebola virus, and so on. We can ill afford to have this level of attack on the continent. So the implication with churches closing because of the devastating effect of this and so on. I just pray that the Lord preserves us, that the Lord also uses the COVID-19 and its attendant fear in people's hearts to draw them to the living God. So that's an immediate one. The second is the training of pastors. It's difficult to overemphasize that. The training of pastors, different levels. You have the university level. You have the small seminars that are taking place at grassroots level, and so on. But it's a dire need that we have on the continent because churches are starting literally everywhere, and people are running those churches. Some of them don't even have a full Bible, let alone training. And if we don't train them and provide books and so on to them, wildfires are obviously going to come forth. So the training of pastors would definitely be the second one that I would put there. And then just, thirdly, the young generation that are coming through, as most of them first generation believers, just praying that the Lord will among them arrest a generation that will be in love with the gospel of God and the God of the gospel, and want to spend and be spent for him. I mean, if I can go to the grave leaving behind such a generation that has imbibed who God is and his blessed gospel, I would be glad to say, yes, life was worth the living. Just pray that the Lord will raise up such an army.
Well, Conrad, thank you so much for speaking with us today and helping us, I hope, just understand a little bit more about what God is doing all around the world in places like Africa, in Zambia, in your church. We really appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. Thanks for the opportunity.
That was Conrad Mbewe on the church in Africa. For more, be sure to check out his book with Crossway, God's Design for the Church, a guide for African pastors and ministry leaders, available online or at your local Christian bookstore. And if you're interested in partnering with Crossway and many others around the world to distribute thousands of copies of Conrad's book throughout the continent of Africa, please visit crossway.org/Africa. That's crossway.org/Africa. For more interviews like this, subscribe to the Crossway Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. If you enjoyed this episode, would you consider leaving us a review? That helps us spread the word about the show. Crossway is a not-for-profit Christian ministry that exists solely for the purpose of proclaiming the truth of God's Word through publishing gospel-centered content. Visit us today at crossway.org.